In this episode, Kari Dickson speaks about children's fiction from Norway, authors Erika Fatland, Rune Christiansen, and about the novel she translated so beautifully, The Lonliness in Lydia Erneman's life. Kari Dickson is an award-winning translator from Norwegian. Her work includes crime fiction, literary fiction, children's books, theatre, and non-fiction. She is also an occasional tutor in Norwegian language, literature and translation at the University of Edinburgh, and has worked with British Centre for Literary Translation, the National Centre for Writing, and the Translators Association. So, welcome, Kari, to our podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Tell us about your association with Norway and Norwegian language.
My mother was Norwegian, so I grew up speaking Norwegian because I was very lucky because my grandparents couldn't speak English. We have quite big generation gaps in our family, and it meant that whenever we went to Norway in the summer, we had to speak Norwegian if we were going to communicate them. So I spoke Norwegian from as soon as I could speak. And as a result of that, I have parts of my experience going out fishing, collecting mushrooms, berries, all that kind of vocabulary is much stronger in Norwegian than it is in English, because that's what we did in the summer. But because I only really spoke it with my grandparents or people who came to visit us in Scotland, it was quite old-fashioned language. And I moved to Norway when I was 18 to work as an au pair, and I very quickly updated my language because people thought I sounded really quaint and old-fashioned. And so I learned to swear and I learned slang So I've spoken Norwegian all my life. And then I went on to university and did Scandinavian studies at the University College London. So I had four years of formal education. And it was quite interesting because I spoke Norwegian fluently at that stage, but I'd never written it and I'd never formally learned the grammar. So it was quite an interesting and at times painful process to relearn a language I could already speak. But that's also where I started reading a lot of the Norwegian literature and the canon.
So when you say Norwegian, you have different versions of Norwegian, I believe, because I was reading articles about Jan Fossa.
Aha. Yeah.
Which is a version that you are referring to?
New Norwegian, which is what Fossa writes in, is a language that was constructed and developed in the 1800s. And it is based on the dialects that are spoken in Western and Central Norway. So it's actually only spoken on TV and on stage. What people speak is their dialect. And then Nynorsk, in a way, is a written standard for that people. And it's spoken mainly it's used mainly on the west coast and central Norway. So I grew up. The Norwegian I speak is the Norwegian that they've always spoken on the east coast, but the written standard is based on Danish and is developed from Danish. This is interesting. So Danish works on a two-gender system, masculine, feminine, one gender, and neuter is another. Most dialects in Norway have a three-gender system, for example. So there have been all these language reforms through Norway, from riksmål, which is the old-fashioned, what the Danes spoke. It's basically Danish with a Norwegian accent. And that's what is the written, whereas people would be speaking their dialect, they would be writing riksmål. Riksmål then developed into something called bokmål. And then there's even something called radical bokmål, which is where they use a three-gender system and A endings. So language in Norway is pretty complex and often quite political because it's what you choose to speak. But they have the advantage of it is that dialect is perfectly accepted. So they have nothing like received pronunciation in Britain. So in a way, it's not posher to speak one way or the other. It's a really interesting landscape. I know about it superficially through my own studies and things like that, but I'm not an expert on Norwegian language politics at all. I can talk about reforms and I can tell you the broad outline. Yeah.
About your translations, mostly the Norwegian literature, which form it is? It is a new Norwegian? Or?
Both. I work from both, yeah.
So what kind of books that you used to read when you were in school? In younger days?
Obviously, we got a lot of books from Norway. So a lot of particularly children's books. Picture books were what I read in Norwegian. And then as I got older, I read a lot of books about other countries. Only thinking about this, whether they were Tolkien, imaginary countries, or I was obsessed as sort of a 12-year-old. I read a lot about the Russian courts. I've always been interested in Southeast Asia, so I read stuff, and I have relatives in Australia, so we got books from Australia. So I guess I've always read quite a broad church. And it's never been specifically British. For example, my mother, in her wisdom, never let us read Enid Blyton. So that is something that is not part of my childhood. So there you go. But we read a lot. We were a household that read. I grew up, we never had a TV, so we read.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. One interesting thing is that Scandinavian countries, they produce wonderful children fiction. Why is that? Why that specific focus on children fiction?
There are several things. They have a very strong tradition of folk tales. So again, at the time that new Norwegian language was being constructed in the 1800s, there's a period where there was a sort of blossoming of national romanticism. And there were two guys called Asbjørnsen and Moe, who went around, again, central, western, eastern Norway, because getting to the north of Norway, it takes a long time. But they went round and they collected the oral traditions and the stories that were told on the farms, and they made them into a 2-volume collection. And most children in Norway will have that. They'll be given it at some point. So that's one thing, is that there is this this folktale tradition. I think that latterly, this idea of democracy, children are seen and treated as adults. Not as adults, but they're given equal priority in many ways. So that children's literature has been very strong from the 1800s. And they're not pandered to, they're not patronized in the same way. One of the other things strikes me about a lot of Scandinavian children's literature is the quality of the illustrations, particularly in picture books. But I think also, if you think of something like Astrid Lindgren with Pippi Longstocking, there is an equality about the way people are treated, the way girls are treated in her books in particular. So I think that there is this really strong tradition of children's stories. And in the 50s in Norway, there were 3 voices in particular in children's literature that were heard, which was Ulf Preussen, who also wrote songs, and he wrote Mrs. Pepperpot. And then there was a woman called Inger Hagerup, and she wrote poetry and stories, and someone called Torbjørn Enger, who wrote books. But they were also on the radio at the time. There was the first national radio. So they were voices that everyone heard. When you were growing up, everyone heard these voices. Everyone had these books. And for my generation, we were then given them by our parents, by our grandparents, because that is what... So there's canon almost of children's literature as well. And for example, Maria Parr, who writes Waffle Hearts, who you might have heard about. Waffle Hearts is a book that has sold extremely well to lots of countries and is seen to be a modern classic in Norway and also in Britain after it was translated. And again, it's this kind of Pippi Longstopping. Children are allowed to go out, they're allowed to play, they're allowed to be feisty. Yeah, so I think that, but also that because they're rural, they live a slightly different life, they have to use their imagination in different ways. Because I'm saying that this is my opinion, so it's not, because people have grown up with the tradition of children's books, they are able to write children's books, and they want to write children's books, and they see children's books as being worthy of writing, if that makes sense. And I hope I'm not patronizing or criticizing other countries. And then there is a system whereby the Norwegian Cultural Council buys 1,500 copies of children's books and young adult books that are published, or they select certain things, which means that people are able to take risks in a very different way. And a lot of authors write in several genres. So two extremes that I can say where they've written about. Jørn Lier Horst, who is a prolific crime fiction writer, former policeman. He has written children's books, so a children's detective series, but he's also written a book about forensics for children. Fosse also writes children's books. So I literally just read, as he won the Nobel Prize, a book that is about to be translated into English by Damien Searles, or it will be in the future, called The Dog Manuscript, which is delightful. And it's 3 stories about old dogs, which can be read by children and can also be read by adults with extra depth. But yeah, so people really, and Kjersti Andersdotter Skomsvold, who is best known for her novels, has also written children's books. So yeah, I think it's given a lot of, and you asked about if there are any indie, and I say this again with a bit of caution. To my knowledge, as far as I'm aware, there are no publishers in Norway that are dedicated to children's literature. All publishers publish children's literature. And there are some, so there's one, for example, when I was growing up, there was a publisher called Dum, which published an enormous amount of children's literature. So most of the books that we were given as children would have been published by Dum, but they published lots of other stuff as well. And they merged with Cappelen, which was one of the big publishing houses, in 2007 to become the biggest publishing house in Norway. So the major publishing houses all have children's sections, and they all have agents who are dedicated to selling children's titles. But to my knowledge, and if anyone hears this and can correct me, please do, to my knowledge, there's no one who's dedicated to children's literature. And and young adult fiction is on the rise at the moment, and it's on the rise as an export from Norway. So it's more popular, and you asked about why again, and I think it's also because they cover subjects that are difficult, that other cultures may not. So there are books about death, there are books about sex for children and for young adults, there are books about, and just think of Jostein Gaarde, Sophie's World, was written for young readers. It's not a picture book, but it was actually initially aimed at teenagers to teach them, or young people to teach them about philosophy.
Yeah, that's wonderful, because that creates a very strong reading culture in the society as a whole, the whole country, right? So it's wonderful.
And an interesting thing is that Norwegians were very slow to take on. They have a lot of book clubs. So I think the physical book is still very, yeah.
What sparked your interest in translations?
I thought about it vaguely when I was little and I was reading these books that my friends couldn't read. But I don't think I knew you could make a career out of it, if that makes sense. And I initially worked in theatre. I was a front house manager. So I'd studied Scandinavian studies at university, and then I went off to work in theatres in London. I don't know. I think that my name was put forward by one of my university lecturers, but I was asked to do a literal translation of an Ibsen play. So The Lady from the Sea was the first play that I translated in a literal version, which was then used by the Women's Playhouse Trust and scripted by a playwright. So I did my initial literal translation, and then I met with the director and the playwright, and we talked through the translation. The playwright went off and wrote a new script, and then it was directed. And then I was, not much later, within a year, I think, I was asked to do the same for Hedda Gabler for the Manchester Exchange. And that made me realise that it was something that I could do and that I enjoyed. And it brought together, in a way, two passions, which was, at that point, theatre and literature. So I then went and did a master's in translation at the University of Surrey. And at that stage, I, again, was not aware if there were any universities that did literary translation specifically. I was not aware of them. But Surrey University had a Scandinavian option in their translation studies. So I went and did that. And the head of the department knew that I was interested in literary translation. And she put me in touch with an organisation called NORLA. I don't know if you've heard of them. NORLA. A phenomenal organisation. And they're the envy of translators the world over. So it's a government-funded organisation that promotes Norwegian literature abroad. And they support and assist and encourage translators, and they provide subsidies for translation. So at the stage when I got in touch with them, I realised now I was hugely fortunate, because there was the people who had been translating into English in Britain up to that point were getting older. And it was also at the time when the Scandi noir crime wave, if you like, took off. And so I arrived at a time when suddenly there was a surge in work, and some of the older translators were retiring. And so it still took me 5 years to transition from doing commercial translation to literary. And at that point, it still wasn't I wasn't making a full-time living. So yeah, that's how I got interested in how I started in translation.
So when did you start translating children's literature?
2014.
It was commissioned, or you chose to translate?
Again, I've been extremely fortunate in that work has always come to me. So I haven't pitched, slightly embarrassing to say, I haven't actually pitched for anything. But what happens, because Norway has this NORLA, and they have a very well-oiled literary machine, and they have improved it and got better and better, and they realise that this is something that is worth investing in. The agents, the Norwegian literary agents, who previously were attached to the big publishing houses, that's not, the publishing scene in Norway has changed tremendously in the past 20 years. But they commission sample translations, which they then send out to publishers all over the world. And for that, they use an English translation. Unless French, German, English. For countries where they have a translator who works into that language, they will do a sample into that language. But English is used to sell beyond, because most people speak English. With children's picture books, because picture books are so short, they often commission the entire book. So I was asked to do a book called My Father's Arms Are a Boat. It was actually 2012 that I translated it, but it was published in 2014. And in Norwegian, it was called Jeg kan ikke sove nå. In New Norwegian, written by Stein Erik Lunde and illustrated by someone called Øyvind Thorsæter. That was then bought by Enchanted Lion Books in New York. And I have to confess that most of the work I've done for children's books has been, apart from two, has been books illustrated by Øyvind Thorsæter. Claudia Bedrick and I share a passion for his books and his work. But that has been, I've now done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And there's a 7th one, which hasn't been published yet, of his books for Enchanted Lion. I also did Kjersti Skomsvold, who I talked about earlier, Bedtime for Bo. And then one of the books called Brown won the Batchelder Book Prize. And then Amazon got in touch and asked me to translate a book called Agnes's Book. Agnes is played by Marit Larsen and it illustrated by Jenny Løvli. But another one that I love, which I did was published in 2017 by Margaret K. McKeldry. I'm making sure I get these names. So it's all been for American publishers as well, which is called The Ballad of the Broken Nose by a writer called Arne Svingen, who writes for young adults. And it's this wonderful story of a boy called Bart who all he wants to do is be an opera singer. But his mother thinks he needs to toughen up, so she sends him to boxing classes. And as the story progresses, you realise that he comes from, his mother is overweight, depressed, lives in social housing, comes from quite a deprived, not an easy background. The house where they live, there are drug addicts. But it's this beautiful book about a young boy who is warm and has this out there dream.
The other one that I came across, which was very interesting to me, is by Erika Fatland, Hi.
I love that book. So for the last few years, I have been, again, I keep saying it, I've been so fortunate. I've translated 3 books by Erika, translated authors who I love, and I've worked with 4 of them for the last 4 years. And Hi is Erika's travels in the Himalayas. So she's a remarkable woman who goes off for months on end and travels on her own. And the first 2 novels are basically about Russia. And Hi is about, the Himalayas. And she travels all over the Himalayas to the most remote places on her own and is primarily looking at women in the Himalayas. When I read it for the first time, I said to her, gosh, this is very different from your other books. There's less history. And she went, oh, I wouldn't dare embark on the history of all that part of the world and all those little countries and all those, and Indian history. And it's very much about her meetings with people. And it makes me want to go there so badly, to some of these little tribes up in the back. Fascinated. And I think that is her real strength, is her meetings with people. And she says that in order to do that, she has to travel alone. And she goes off on her own on these long journeys to places where they might not have seen, and certainly in Russia and things like that, where they might not have seen a small red-haired woman before. But she has an ability to talk to people and to get stories out of them. And one of the interesting things she said about Hi is that because she was a foreigner, she was also allowed into spaces that women were not allowed into normally. So that And because her guides were often, or her interpreters were often men, she was able to see both parts of society where women would not necessarily have access to the men's world and men wouldn't be allowed into the women's world. So she crisscrossed.
Does she speak English?
Yes, she's a polyglot. She speaks Russian, English. She's just been traveling the Portuguese Empire, so she may well have learned Portuguese by now. I think she tried to learn Chinese, but found it very challenging. And her background is social anthropology and Russian studies.
Now, given the choice, if you have to pick up a certain kind of book, what would you like to translate all through?
To be honest, books like the ones I've been translating for the past 4 or 5 years, I like. So one of the writers I translate is a woman called Gunhild Øyehaug, who writes in New Norwegian. And she has an amazing mind. I would love to rent space in her mind for a while. So she's a very meta writer. She has an in-depth knowledge of literary theory, literary history. And her latest book, Evil Flowers, which was published in America, is obviously based on Rambo. Is it Rambo? Yeah. And she will write mini universes. And I've translated 2 novels and 2 short story collections. So she's written most short stories. So they really are mini universes. And they might have an arc. So there might be a string running through them. But her mind is extraordinary. So and that varies from love stories to and love stories between humans and androids up on in a space shuttle. And there was one that I remember I started out on, and it was about a man sitting down at the fish market in Bergen. You never quite know whether he's actually just pretending to sell things because he likes being part of the community, but it's very realistic. And then he sees another man running along the end of the pier and he wonders why he's carrying a heavy stone. And then in the footnotes, you read about this man who's carrying the heavy stone, and it's completely fantastical. He has to wade through syrup to go to school. And I love that bonkers, the way you have to just go with her because she digresses. But I've learned to trust that she will always come back. She will always loop it round. And is structurally and stylistically a really good writer. Rune Christiansen, who I know we're going to talk about, is also a great stylist. And I also translate his partner, Mona Høvring, who is also a poet and a writer and a stylist. And she can write equally fantastical novels. And I love doing that kind of thing, where I'm challenged linguistically, I'm challenged stylistically, I'm thrilled by madness at points and also touched by beauty. What more can I say? And when I do things like this, it's really good because it reminds me of my great good fortune. Yeah.
So tell us about the harshest criticism and glowing praise you received in your translation work.
The harshest criticism was for a crime novel that I translated, and it was an online review. But they said, who is this woman? She's like a 4th grade translator. She's got it completely wrong. She clearly doesn't speak the language. Oh, that must have been around 2010. Trying to think I'd been translating for about 10 years then. Another one was where an author refused to work with me because he thought I wasn't good enough. But then, go figure, the next book I did won a prize. But I have a little stash that I keep in the archive from my emails, was from James Wood, the American literary critic and literary scholar, who done a short story by Gunhild Øyehaug, the woman I was talking about, for him, and Claire Masood for a publication that they were editing. And they wrote back and they said, we don't want to change anything. And for me, from James Wood as a literary big god, if you like, in America, that's my personal bit where I thought, wow, I was starstruck.
So, were there any characters that had a lasting impact on you after translating it for a while?
Lydia.
Oh,
Lydia Erneman. I want to be Lydia Erneman.
I'm glad that I picked that book.
I want to live her life. I thought that was very neat when those questions came under.
I have a lot to talk about the book.
Have you read it?
Yes, of course.
Did you like it?
Of course, yes. Of course, yes. So, what does translation mean to you personally?
There's a broad range of things. For me, it's something I can do because I speak two languages, and it allows me to live in the two worlds and cultures that I've grown up in. Some days I feel more Norwegian than I do British, and some days I feel more British that's irrelevant of where I'm living. And I often say that I'm happiest halfway between the two countries. Doesn't matter which direction I'm going in. So that ability to live constantly in two cultures, two languages is a privilege. And that is my skill, if you like. I often talk about translation as a way of life. So this idea of it is a career. It is quite a hard career at times because we sometimes have to fight to be recognised and to get fair pay and to all those things. And being a freelancer is never easy. I love being a bridge between two cultures, being able to bring something from one culture into another culture that gives people a window on things out with their daily life. And if that's from another culture, from another country, I think it expands our horizons. It allows us to travel in our armchairs. I can read books from India that teach me about a life that is so different from my own. So I think that is absolute value of translation. I think also there, and with that, there is what I would call a political element, is that it makes us more tolerant, it makes us more open, makes us more curious. And that the more open, one of the books I translated was called Literature and War. And this is very pertinent at the moment. It was a Norwegian who'd been reading about the Palestine-Israel conflict. He didn't really know enough about either side. So as a writer, he went to Israel and interviewed 10 Israeli authors and 10 Palestinian authors about their books and about their writing, but also about what was going on and how they view the other. So I think that if we read literature that come from a space that we're not familiar with, we open ourselves. And I think that the more people who are open and tolerant of difference, the less our political systems can stir up conflict when it suits them. If that makes sense. So that's from the deeply personal to the...
Now we will come to Lydia. Before we get into the book, please introduce us to the author, Rune Christiansen.
So Rune Christiansen he's a prolific author. He's a very shy author as well. He's a very modest man. I met him for the first time this summer. He's delightful. But he is, I don't know, could you say primarily a poet? He's published 15 poetry collections and 10 novels. He started off writing poetry. So his first publication in 1986 was poetry, and his first novel was published in 1990. And he's also done a novella and a collection of essays. His most recent publications have both been poetry. And then in 2021, his last novel is The Case of the Caprice of Lost Time. It's going to be called, and it's going to be published by Book Hug in Canada again. And he has a very distinct manner of writing where titles are entire little compositions on their own. So I don't know if you notice that the start of chapters, they have some quite complex chapter headings, which are stories. He often has chapters where there are extracts from other fiction or from things that do not belong strictly to the story, but that back up what's going on. And each chapter, and the way he writes is that they're often very long paragraphs, they're quite long sentences. I don't know, it's poetry. It can be very simple. It can be very simple and it can be extremely poetic. But it's like he layers things. So it's like building up a painting. So for me, it's I really visualize the lives of these people and how they live. And one of the other extraordinary things is there is almost no direct speech in any of these books that I've translated. And they are loosely seen to be not a trilogy, but it's acknowledged that they run together. So Lydia was actually the first book that he wrote in 2014, which was followed by Fanny and the Mystery of the Grieving Wood in 2017, and then this new, the Case of the Caprice of Lost Time in 2021. So Fanny is very obviously about grieving and death. Lydia is about life and love. And the next one, the Case of the Caprice of the Lost Time, which again shows you some of his, and that one he riffs a bit on crime because he loves Josephine Tey, classical crime.
So please introduce us to Lydia, the loneliness in Lydia Erneman's life.
When I first read this, I was absolutely captivated. And like I say, and with Fanny as well, Fanny has lived on with me until I met Lydia. I think Lydia usurps everyone. I just thought she resonates with me so much. So she is, I'm trying to think how to introduce it. She is a woman who's grown up as an only child in a remote farm in the far north of Sweden. And she is a very self-contained woman, as her parents were. Though you learn latterly that maybe her mother wasn't quite so self-contained. And she decides she wants to be a vet, and she goes to the south of Norway, the south of Sweden. She trains to be a vet, and then she ends up in a rural community in Norway where she works as a vet, and she is deeply contented with her life. So at this point, I always said, is it really the loneliness of Lydia Erneman's life, in Lydia Erneman's life, or is it solitude? So we talked about this a lot, but it is the loneliness, because then what happens is she meets this young boy who comes to her because he has found a dog that's been run over, and they develop a unique relationship, because the boy is quite awkward. He comes from a difficult family, and he and Lydia meet in what I guess is their solitariness. And Lydia starts to question if she would like to have a child. And then it becomes, in a way, this is the loneliness in her life. So she's very happy with her life, but there is this question. It's not a dramatic book. It's not. And then she meets a man, they have children, and it's all very low key. There's that beautiful bit about what we leave behind us. And she inherits her mother's grey coat. And so she thinks that her mother's grey coat, she needs to wear it every day. So she wears it to work, and it gets dirty, and it doesn't. And I think that's one of the things that really appeals to me, It's the quietness, what's unsaid. And it allows you to really to live it in a very different way. Interestingly, not everyone likes it. Interestingly, how could they not like it? So I actually had to go and pick up the Norwegian version this morning from someone I'd lent it to. And she couldn't get into it at all. It's brutal. Lingering is a really good word for it. It lingers. It really does. And her doubts and her questions, you feel her sincerity. But I suppose it's a book, all three books actually have a very dreamlike quality where reality and dreams don't merge, but you're never quite sure where the boundary is. In Fanny, it's even greater, I think, but that's also because she's grieving in a different way. But there are some dreams in Lydia where dreams become part of the story. And I think you have to be in a place where you can get into that headset. If you're sitting down to read for energy, you want plot-driven, don't go near it. But if you want to be reflective and dive into that space, I think you will be rewarded. There's no doubt. You really get a sense of who they are and of the relationship between them, even though it's never specified. So the fact that she loves her memory of her father is always smoking, I recognize that character and that the feeling that he gives her, even though I don't necessarily have anyone like that, and that's not my father. There's a kind of recognition of, she's a very self-contained, serene, mindful in many ways. She just does what she does and she lives what she lives. But the loneliness is this questioning that comes in and out of her life. Have I done the right thing? Should I go back to my father? Does he need me? Does he not need me? All those, which are very human questions. I think we all have them. But for me as a woman, he made me realize that thing of being content alone as well. That kind of, but how I think about how important relations are to ourselves, to others. So the lovely little descriptions about the vet when she goes to visit the various farms and how they respond to her without us knowing what exactly they're thinking or feeling or saying. There's a chemistry, it's almost like magic, that he produces this feeling without telling us what to think.
Now, please read a couple of paragraphs from the book in English and Norwegian.
So this is from the middle of the book, and I just thought it illustrates Lydia's life and the style of the book. Våren kom tidlig. Allerede I begynnelsen av mars flagret milde vinder forbi, og smeltevannet dryppet og rant I takkerenner og avløp. Var det bare en falsk bebudelse? Nei, varmen este frem. Grønnsværet anget og slo ut overalt, fylte og løftet trekronene, og den som hadde vært sparsomt og ubetydelig, ble nå mektig og umåtelig nærværende. Og selvfølelsen, den vokste den også, for til tross for at Lydia avsluttet forbindelsen med Bård da han flyttet nordover etter endt praksis, ble hverdagen mer forsonlig, nettene håpfulle. Hun utførte arbeid med en form for løssluppen likevekt. Lyset tente henne, selv midt I en kritisk tildragelse med blod og skit oppover til alvene, la hun merke til den milde kvitring ute I solskinnet. Hun var der hun ville være, I det landlige, det provinsielle. Hun tok seg I å tenke at den paradoksale tilværelsen, den sløve og godmodige tilfredsheten våren fremkalte, har blitt forært henne. Hjemme drev hun med sine bedagelige sysler. Hun leste I forskjellige anatomibøker, noterte ned dagens hendelse I det lyseblå heftet, korte riss bare, et og annet spørsmål, med det ene og det andre som hun måtte huske og slå opp, ting hun ville sette seg nøyere inn i. Best av alt likte hun å stelle i urtebedet. Hun hadde stor glede av å holde på der i den lune kroken av hagen, i den lille jordflekken som hun stadig utvidet. Selv i solnedgangen var det tilstrekkelig med lys. Hun holdt det gående til mørket falt på, gravde og luket og rakte. Det lå en egen langsomhet i disse gjøremålene, og det frodige miniatyrlandskapet var fylt med øresmå levende vesener som kravlet omkring i ro og mak, eller flyktet reddslagne fra den gedigne skapningens flittige hender. Spring came early. Milder winds blew in at the start of March, and the melting snow dripped and ran down from gutters and pipes. Was it just a false promise? No, the warmth continued, the grass swelled and released its scent, the treetops filled out and lifted their heads, and what had been sparse and insignificant now became vital and intensely present. Her self-esteem grew too, and even though Lydia had broken off with Bård when he finished his placement and moved north, her days were more appeasing, her nights hopeful. She carried out her work with a kind of unrestrained equilibrium. The light served her well, and even in the middle of a critical situation with blood and shit up to her elbows, she heard the gentle twittering outside in the sunshine. She was where she wanted to be, in the country, in the provinces. She found herself thinking that this paradoxical existence, the lethargic and good-natured satisfaction that came with spring, had been bestowed upon her. She occupied herself with leisurely activities at home. She studied various anatomy books, made notes about the day's events in her light blue journal, brief outlines, the odd question, this and that to look up, things she wanted to explore more. But most of all, she liked to work on the herb bed. She got immense pleasure from this sheltered corner of the garden and the small piece of ground that she was constantly expanding. Even at sunset there was light enough, and she would carry on digging, weeding and raking until darkness fell. There was beautiful slowness to these chores, and the lush miniature landscape was teeming with tiny creatures that wriggled and peacefully crept around or fled in terror from the giant being's hands.
Thank you very much, Kari. Thank you for the time and the wonderful session.
You're most welcome. Thank you.